Flashbangs are an effective tactical weapon in the modern era, which begs the question, how would they fare in Path of Exile? With flashbangs we can effectively blind our enemies as well as ourselves if we aren't wearing the proper protective eyewear. What you are seeing is the combination of galvanic arrow, traps, barrage support, and copious amounts of projectile speed. Like the flashbang grenade, this allows us a timed explosive that will explode with a series of quick, bright flashes. Trap support allows us to throw a triggerable explosion, while barrage support gives us the series of explosions effect. In addition, galvanic arrow creates a small cone flash explosion, and the area of effect has the unique property of being increased by projectile speed, a stat that suddenly became very accessible with cluster jewels. There's two key notables that can be found on medium clusters, Streamlined and Aerodynamics, that give us large amounts of projectile speed. With just 4 of these jewels, we can get up to 200% increased projectile speed. That's the premise of this build. Now we'll get into the gearing choices for the character. First up, we are also scaling this build with Doomfletch, a weapon that gives us 100% of each element gained as physical, making flat fizz on our gear and jewels a very important stat to scale our damage. So with Doomfletch as our bow, we have low physical, we need to get that physical higher, which then gets scaled by the gain to each element mod. This bow is not necessarily the optimum damage, I just wanted to make a Doomfletch bow, or a Doomfletch build, so I did. You can definitely make this build using either a well-crafted rare or another bow of your choosing. This is not necessarily the optimum choice by any stretch of the imagination. Second up, we also built this build around using the Eternity Shroud solely because I noticed it was rather cheap in the current meta, and I have never made an Eternity Shroud build. The chest piece is best used by double dipping on the gained as elemental as chaos mod, by basically converting your lightning to cold and your cold to fire, and then you get that mod basically 2 or 3 times on the same damage. We didn't actually do this, so it's not really an optimum use of this thing. We just really were using it for the sake of, hey, I've never done the Eternity Shroud build before, I wanted to try out the chest piece. This effectively ends up making the gearing much more expensive than it really needs to be, and rather kind of limiting what items you can choose, because certain uniques you can't really get shaped, or to get them shaped it makes it much more expensive. You have to like chance our Doomfletch, for example. So in this portion of the build I wouldn't particularly recommend this route. Well, while we're going through, I'll recommend, hey, this is alternative ways you can do each gear piece. Don't worry about necessarily doing Eternity Shroud. The alternative to begin with for this chest piece would be using a Tinker Skin. It has a ton of quality of life for trap builds. It gives you a ton of sustain. Honestly, that's what I would end up really going with, unless you have a bunch of budget and you wanted to copy the build exactly. For our gloves, we awaken orb together a projectile speed support and trap support pair of gloves to get both the projectile speed and trap damage mods, and along with hopefully awakening orb and getting life as well. Alternatively, for non-Eternity Shroud variants, I would definitely recommend Slave Driver's Hands. It makes the mana sustain for traps 100% solved because you're using blood magic with your trap throws, as well as giving you a way to get a lot of trap throwing speed by making it so cast speed also applies to your trap throwing speed. 100%, this is definitely usually the way you want to go with trappers. For our helmet, we grab a projectile speed enchant. With how much projectile speed we have in other places, you start getting diminishing returns on how much area of effect you're actually getting out of the mod. At the end of the day, if you really want to optimize the build, definitely go for the projectile or the damage on Galvanic Arrow. This is not an optimum choice we are making here. We are solely doing it for the memes of getting more projectile speed and making the flashes bigger, when in reality this is barely increasing our area of effect, considering how much projectile speed we already have in other places. In making this helmet a Shaper helmet, we have to Warlord Slam or Influence Orb Slam and then Awaken Orbit together with a Shaper helmet. We chose to do the +1 power charge and from the Warlord and the 6% increased elemental damage taken from the Shaper helmet. At the end of the day, this is another example of all these items get more expensive because we have to force on Shaper Influence, and one of the main ways to do that is to take an item that has the specific enchant you want, and then you have to use an Influence Orb and then an Awakener Orb to get the Shaper Influence with that specific enchant. It's a very expensive process. Definitely I would just recommend grabbing the enchant and craft it with some life essences or some pristine fossils for the helmet. For the boots, this is non-negotiable. If you're a trapper build, always get the increased enchant applied if you haven't crit recently. The reason for this is it always applies to trap builds, because when our traps trigger and they crit, it does not count as you the player critting, meaning we always have 120% increased crit chance from this enchant. It's absolutely massive for trap builds. That's non-negotiable. Just buy boots with that enchant and then craft life, essences, fossil spam. We had to, again, do the thing where we Redeemer Orb slammed it and then Awakener Orb to hope we get a decent thing out of the Awakener Orb. Our Awakener Orb was horrible, so we just recrafted with a Strength Essences. Similarly to the boots, we wanted a Stygian Vise with Shaper Influence, so we had to Hunter, slam it first, and then Shaper Influence together. Alternatively, we crafted this with Pristine Prismatic Fossils at the end of the day. Alternatively, I would just buy a Hunter leather belt and craft with Pristine Prismatic Fossils in order to hopefully get high life, high resistances. For our Quiver, we are still addicted to projectile speed, so we crafted these with the Deafening Essences of Dread to get 50 Proj speed. And we got really lucky because we were going basically for an additional arrow and Proj speed. We would have been happy with those two mods and we would have stopped there. When we hit the extra projectile, we also got life and elemental damage with attacks, which was an absolutely massive Quiver to have. And then we slammed on an extra fire res, crafted some more reses we needed on it. This Quiver was an extremely lucky craft for us, but at the end of the day, we were pretty happy with how it turned out. Lastly, for our jewelry, we basically bought shaped bases of an Onyx Amulet and 2 Vermilion Rings, and we spammed these with Deafening Essences of Scorn. If you don't know, Deafening Essence of Scorn basically gives you the highest crit multi-roll you can roll on rings and amulets, and on top of that, it makes it so you can roll or force roll crit multi onto rings, whereas previously you would just have to... You couldn't really get crit multi on rings any other way. Now you can have them on Warlord's Influence rings. But basically, we were basically just rolling these with these Deafening Essence of Scorn until we hit high life and one other desirable mod. That's how we crafted these. Alternatively, you can basically just buy your own rings and buy decent ones, because if you don't have to have it shaped to begin with, then you can probably buy decent rings for a cheap price. Whereas if you have to buy a shaped version of a good ring, it starts to become a lot more expensive. That sums it up for the gear. Now let's head in game and go over gem links, the passive tree, flasks, and a few other miscellaneous things. Alright, we're in game. Let's go over gem links. To start off with, our mage damage support, and pretty much we used the majority of the time, was a barrage support along with cluster trap support, along with trap support, galvanic arrow, inspiration, and charge traps. If you're using the Slave Driver's Hands and mana isn't a problem, then you can switch out inspiration for elemental damage with attacks. Next up for our supports, this is the funny thing, is basically we didn't really make use of many supports here or many gem link setups. We probably missed out on some good opportunities more or less because I didn't take the time to really look into it, and this is where you can improve the build. I basically have what I would call wasted links. So here we have another gem link setup for Galvanic Arrow, but this one's just basically its sole purpose is to just be more flashy and even more obnoxious. So it's barrage support with cluster traps, with Galvanic Arrow, with Arrow Nova, along with being supported with trap and faster projectiles. So this one just kind of looks a little bit on the funnier side, I would say. So if we throw these things out, you'll see that they come down and they do kind of a big little circle like this. Yeah, so they're even more, you know, flamboyant and obnoxious with how aesthetic they are for the gameplay. Really, this is just great for just causing the screen to be even more bright, even more flashy, but ultimately there's no reason for it other than looks. Here we have basically a bear trap setup, so we can have a longer lasting bear trap. We had efficacy, advanced traps, increased duration. At the end of the day, increased duration and bear traps really is just a 2-link setup. You don't need these extra links. I just had an entire 6-link I wasn't doing anything with. And in my helmet, I have dash and second wind. You could also link that to enhance to make your dash cooldown even quicker, which I would recommend. For auras, we have Herald of Purity, we have Summon Skitterbots, we have Precision, and we had an Enlighten here, I think. At the end of the day, if you put the Enlighten with the Herald of Purity... Well, actually, you couldn't do this, because we needed Infernal Legion linked to our Summon Skitterbots. You'll see they have the Infernal Legion thing. This is so they apply Burning to enemies, so that way we get crit multi from Explosive Expert. The only reason we had to do this is because we went through the trouble of trying to put Secrets of Suffering into the build. At the end of the day, I don't think this really ended up benefiting us this much because we weren't inflicting that good of ailments because we were hitting enemies with a bunch of series of small hits, which doesn't really inflict good ailments. So at the end of the day, I would swap this out, get another Fettle here, get more life, and then go for, instead of Infernal Legion here, you just have Skitterbots, and you save some mana reservation, and you can have Herald of Purity, Skitterbots, Precision, all linked to an Enlighten here. Now let's get into Flasks. We went for a Life Flask with Immunity to Freeze, because we already have Shock and Ignite immunity, so we don't need those anywhere, because we get that from Saboteur. We have Dying Sun for Area of Effect, as well as 2 extra projectiles, so that way our mines shoot 2 more times in the barrage setup. We have Bleed immunity with a Diamond Flask for crit. We have an Adziri's Promise. Here, this is a great flask for damage. Alternatively, I think for most of the gameplay I was using Bottled Faith, but I've switched that to another character. Bottled Faith is just really good for crit builds. At the end of the day, it's really expensive. Adziri's Promise is great for damage, and you don't necessarily need Bottled Faith to make the build work. And then we have a Quicksilver with movement speed and reduced charges used. So that's our flasks, that's our Gemlink setups, and now let's go over the passive tree. To start off with, we were Sab. We went for Explosive Experts, Perfect Crime, Pyromaniac, and Born in the Shadows. Pretty much mandatory if you're doing a Saboteur. I think Born in the Shadows, Explosive Experts, and Pyromaniac, you pretty much always want these. These are really good nodes. I don't really know, because I haven't played mines too much with after the mine change, how important Demolition Specialist is. But anyways, for traps, the chain reaction support is not that great, and I wouldn't particularly recommend it. And that's why I'd always recommend going for these 3, and then going for Perfect Crime for trap damage. Next up we have basically our passive tree, which is pretty much us going to Crit Multi, Trap Nodes, and Point Blank and Cluster Jewels. So the important things here are, to start off with, since we are doing a Doomfletch build, we actually make use of this jewel called Coated in Shrapnel. This jewel can roll, I think it rolls somewhere between 2 to 4 and 3 to 6 fizz. You definitely want it on the 3 to 6 end. You'll see what it does is add 3 to 6 fizz to all of these small passives here. So we have 3 to 6 here, 3 to 6 here, 3 to 6 here, 3 to 6 here. Everything but the jewel socket within this small radius gets 3 to 6, and we have a lot of small passes that end up getting hit by it. In the end, I think this was averaged out to like an average of 40, 50 fizz or something. It's very good for Doomfletch, and we also have a lot of flat fizz from it here as well. And you can grab things like Corrupted Blood immunity for cheap. You can grab things like increased effect of non-damaging ailments, damage penetration, whatever you want for an implicit. These jewels typically aren't too expensive, because not really too many people are using them. And then for our cluster jewels, large jewels don't matter too much. I went for Area of Effect and some extra elemental damage on this cluster, and on this cluster I went for Prismatic Hark with some elemental resistance, elemental damage, and Inspired Oppression for some elemental damage and effective non-damaging ailments. At the end of the day, just get large jewels with maybe one notable you like with 2 jewel sockets. Should be pretty cheap to get, and then you can go to getting your medium jewels with Streamlined and Aerodynamics, which are also, when I bought these, they were like 5 to 10 C a pop, or I don't think I spent more than 20 C per jewel. They're really pretty cheap. So you get these jewels here on all your mediums to get a lot of projectile speed. I will say this wasn't the most effective way to scale damage. At the end of the day, I was really kind of going for just big, bright flashes. I wasn't min-maxing damage here. These jewels are not necessarily the best in slot for damage or performance of the build. These are solely jewels I went for because I wanted to have fun with big bright flashes. So there's probably other cluster jewels like Crit, or I'm not sure what else, but there are other jewels that will scale damage better, more likely than these projectile jewels will. For our rare jewels, we went for a Precision Crit Multi Jewel, we went for a Life Crit Multi Resistance Jewel, and then we went for Fetals here. And I'd recommend a Fetal here instead of Secrets for Suffering. Same with this, you could also go another Fetal here, just for getting a lot of life, making the build a lot more tanky. And I think that covers the passive tree pretty well. Let's go for Pantheon. Pantheon, I went for Soul of Lunaris. This is solely to give us more dodge and attack spell dodge, and avoidance for projectiles, as well as giving us some movement speed to run through large packs of monsters. This pairs nicely with our Acrobatics Phase Acro dodge chance. As well as for our regular small one, we went for Soul of Ryslotha. This is just so we can keep our life flask in boss fights. When things get hairy, it's nice to have a few extra life flasks available to us. That covers our flask, that covers our Gemlinks, that covers our passive tree. One last thing, for bandits, I'd recommend supporting Alira for the crit multi, resistance, and mana sustain. If not, kill all. The other two I would not recommend. I would not recommend Kraton or Oak. So that covers everything, I think. I hope you guys kind of got a kick out of the build, how to make some flashbang traps, if you're curious about making it. I definitely would consider not necessarily going for the Shaped Eternity Shroud setup. This costs a whole lot of money. It forced specific gear items to happen. We weren't getting the benefit of Slave Driver's Hand. We weren't getting the benefit of something like a Tinker Skin. At the end of the day, you can get a decent amount of damage out of all the extra cast speed you get going for the Slave Drivers versions of a trap build. That can sometimes make up for the amount of damage we get from just going Shaped Eternity Shroud, because it'll free up other gear choices and getting better items in a lot of slots for a lot less money. But anyways, that's the build, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Got a kick out of a fun little thing of making flashbang traps and little party poppers here for fireworks and whatnot. You guys have a good one.